Yeah, right. I mean, like, these are people who, and I had Crystal Ball on. I thought she put it well. She was talking about like the, sort of Virginia, like DC suburbs, where she used to live. Be like, all right, a lot of these people, if you polled them on economic issues, they would give you a lot of the answers that you'd want, right? They would say, oh yeah, sure, we should have, universal
healthcare.
Minimum wage is too low, whatever. Yeah. The question is, are they ever going to prioritize any of this stuff? Push comes to shove.
Right. And priorities are politics, basically, within the coalition. There was a survey that Bhaskar Sankar sent me the other day about basically that just disaggregates this, like where voters are, given a 20 options about like their political priorities, and like working class voters overwhelmingly always say healthcare, jobs, healthcare, jobs, the economy. And professional class voters overwhelmingly say, basically, they say the environment, race relations, and healthcare. Like healthcare is the one place where you can, at least now, you can kind of thread a little bit of a needle, although not necessarily, it's still limited.
Once you start getting into the nitty gritty, I mean, there is a reason.
Then that falls apart too. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason why. I mean, and this relates to your, is it the Patagonian road to socialism? Why this can't be a base for radical transformation. Why during the primary, Elizabeth Warren started to back off from her earlier on ambiguous support for Medicare for all, and started trying to to sort of triangulate about it in a slightly strange way, because a lot of the people who really formed her support base kind of liked it, but they also started to get a little bit nervous that their premium healthcare plans were going to be taken away under single payer.
Yeah, and you have to pay for it. I mean, in some ways, it does come down to that same kind of basically fiscal question that and this is what people on the right center will say in response to the kind of Data for Progress type polling that I think jibes with what Crystal says in a kind of dark way, that all these things poll well, but then when you actually have to institute the fiscal regime that's going to actually pay for them, that's going to actually do the redistributive part rather than just the free goods for the poor part, then it's hard. And yes, some parts of the left, the monetary crew, and like other people would say, well, the deficits don't matter. And I'm I'm not a fiscal hawk. But if there's going to be redistribution at some point, it does have to involve taking some more from the rich and moving it around.
This is where I actually think the stuff that I mean, Rob's book about sort of capitalism and unfreedom and sort of stuff about reclaiming freedom really matters, because I think the professional class resistance to that fiscal policy isn't just I want to keep my money so I can have my house and whatever. It's that they think they worked for it, that this is theirs, that they, in some ways, the professional class, because they went through, they worked hard in high school, they got into college, then they worked throughout college and they went and got some advanced degree, that what they have is what they deserve, and that it's a violation of their freedom to take their money, and that it's a disruption of their life plans. It's not just a constraint on the marginal consumption they've lost. It's a disruption of their life plans and a violation of their own shaping of their own life. And in that way, I something I really came to appreciate is just how hegemonic a certain right-wing view about freedom and personal responsibility really is. And Corey Robin and I wrote this piece called Reclaiming Freedom, and it was about how the right reclaimed freedom over the course of the 20th century from the left, and in particular figures like Hayek, by trying to say, look, the left was wrong for thinking freedom was about becoming free from the economy, being freed from having to spend your whole life worrying about your needs. It's about being freedom in and through the economy, but only if people are subject to the discipline of the market. And so to be really free, you have to be subject to discipline of market, because then you're responsible for your own choices. That's the kind of crude recharacterization. And I think, if you think of the Clinton years and the whole language of personal responsibility, welfare reform was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act or something like that. and this is and it's deeply linked to the ideas of meritocracy. Obama talking about, if I can be here, if I can be president, anybody can be, so long as you work hard. All the crazy Obama knots like tutored poor kids in the DC area to try and instill in them this kind of ethic that if you just work hard enough, you too can succeed. And that has now become a very widespread view that you have created your fate through how you have managed the economy. And it's, I think, a deep, semi-conscious but powerful source of resistance to these fiscal foundations that Matt was just talking about, to tax policy. It's not just the loss of consumption. It's like, I won't be able to go on the vacation I wanted to go on, or maybe it'll be harder for me to get my kids through college. I think it's like they see it as a violation. And
that's a really good point.
And I think that's the real problem. And what was so pernicious about the Clinton and Obama years in particular, because it sunk that view so deep into the mainstream respectable kind of
there's
kind of opinion.
There's a liberalism that's entirely about meritocracy, right? This is the Thomas Frank, not the new book, but the previous one, Listen Liberal. What it's all about. This sort of version of liberalism, replacing New Deal liberalism that really sees like defines social injustice as unfair barriers to meritocracy. If somebody can't build up all of that through their hard work or whatever because of racism or homophobia or something else, then that's a social justice issue. But if people are just living in poverty or are become unemployed due to outsourcing or whatever, that's like a natural event, like an earthquake. That's just the economy doing what the economy does.
Yeah, and that is a really interesting point, Alex. I enjoyed that article you wrote with Corey Robin back there, because all through the Cold War era, with the New Deal period, you had at least a wing of the Democrats willing to say, well, yes, we make a shared sacrifice so we can go to the moon and we can have the great society. It was at least a presence in the political debate, and so it was in people's minds. But that's really true. With the New Democrats and Clinton, and especially Obama. Now, I think a lot of otherwise sort of vague liberal, probably more meritocratic, sympathetic voters now, we're just so unaccustomed to being called upon to make a shared sacrifice that actually, it does come down to, as Matt said, a real, there'll be a fiscal bite to this, there'll be a tax bite. And of course, we naturally want serious progressive taxation and bring back the progressive grades in the income tax, like corporate tax or a wealth tax, things like that real progressive structure. You may be surprised how much we can fund with that. But if we want things like a Green New Deal, a little more ambitious than Medicare for all, there's no question that we won't all, broadly, maybe not, we would have a much broader tax increase on some level. And of course, a lot of people, like you're saying, do have that basic recognition that, well, I don't mind paying taxes. We got to pave the roads. We need schools that my kids don't go to, but others do. There is some respect for that. But as soon as that higher tax bill comes, that really is where the rubber hits the road, and people need to have some sort of ideological preparation for the idea that, yes, you will actually have a higher tax bill in the spring, or a bigger withholding in every paycheck, so we can fund this stuff. So many tens of millions, fairly conservative Americans were willing to accept that because that idea was in the regular political discussion. Now, it's absolutely right. That's completely lost. And that's why, I don't know, when I talk to my activist buddies and stuff, I always feel like there's a strong, especially the younger kids that I teach, I feel like there's a strong drive where people want to go out and do a big action, and we got to do a climate action or a action in defense of Black lives. I'm all for this stuff, but I feel like sometimes we forget that huge role that the education has to play, political education, before you can organize people, make them see why they need to organize, or do a big risky action that blocks traffic and pisses off blue collar people. If everyone doesn't already know what the issue is and sort of have at least some sympathy with it, it's really tough to do that stuff. That's why whenever I am trying to get my goofy family members to contribute to do their charitable giving, whatever, I'm always trying to get them to pitch it toward independent and especially leftist media like Jacobin and Current Affairs, because like that is the boring preparation that has to come before you can organize 1 million people to stop traffic and demand climate action.
Yeah.
But we've lost so much of that. It's rough.
Yeah, and I think that what you're talking about resistance to resistance to the funding part, which of course there is an education component, because this is hegemonic, right? It doesn't just influence people whose financial interests really are adversely affected by this overall, but it is important to take on, and I think you can see even in activist efforts in the last few years the effects even on the left of how hegemonic some of that stuff that Alex was talking about is, because you think about Bernie Sanders, certainly that there were various points in which he accepted the sort of thing that Obama always did, right? That, I'm not going to touch any tax rates under whatever the $250,000 or whatever. He didn't for every issue, but he did for some issues, and even arguably in the post George Floyd unrest, when there was all this emphasis on defunding the police, which I'm not against. I mean, I think if your local police department, has so much, has the kind of budget that can be used to buy tanks, then that can be, I'm certainly not against taking that away from them. But I think that the emphasis on it might indicate a eagerness to try to avoid that conflict about funding, because because there's a sort of implication that, well, actually not even an implication. Like I remember there was a AOC tweet over the summer where she was talking about, taking, various city services that need to be funded more. And she was relating to police defunding and said, we found the budget line. And I wrote a piece for Jacobin about this, say, well, no, you didn't. Right? Like if you took away every cent from the NYPD, which is one of the most lavishly bloated, police departments in the world, you would not even be able to close the funding gaps between the poorest and richest schools in New York City. There is no way to get local social democracy without actually increasing a lot of people's taxes by a lot.
Yeah, and I'm Alex. I'm so struck by your insight there, which I think is actually goes really deep. That it's not even about necessarily the tax bill or about that marginal cost, but that it's ideological, and that it's about, and that in some sense it's not even a question of like, then this bite is gonna, when I see this on my bill, I'm gonna revolt. It's more about, I think this is maybe what I would connect it to is another legacy of the Clinton Obama era, is this sort of derogation of the public sphere, and the kind of understanding that the private world is where efficiency and happens, and where things happen. And so because I think there's also related to that sense of like losing additional income, being constrained by this like big grabby state that wants to do things, is the sense that it won't even work. That, and I think you're seeing that like in Illinois. I mean, there's some mixed verdicts on this, but Illinois voters, even though they, are voted blue 60-40, and they're not at all very, not particularly progressive billionaire governor was out there flogging a progressive income tax, to sort of save the state budget, which is about to implode, as a sort of last hope for Illinois. And voters rejected it. And I'm persuaded, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm persuaded that it's largely on the basis, it's related to Alex's insight, but it's also connected to this idea that the sort of state government of Illinois is not competent or capable of actually, enhancing anything with this additional funding. And so that my zone of responsibility is, that money is better with me, even if services fail. And then of course it's a doom loop where more services fail, and, and the sort of, the quid pro quo is not quid pro quo. What is the Latin line, Ben? Help me. The syllogism, I guess, is proved, that if this, then that, and it becomes a circle of syllogisms, and everyone loses out. And I mean, I worry that ideology runs pretty deep in the Democratic Party of Obama, Biden, in that you still see real expertise, real efficiency, real know-how always is going to come from the private sector, especially now the new tech the sort of the tech world. I mean, how many of the new Biden staffers that we just saw appointed have all these, corporate backgrounds? They're the only people that know how to run anything. They're the only people that know how to do anything. And it really becomes this, I think in some ways that element is almost harder than the pure fiscal bite element to convince people that Medicare for all can actually work. And frankly, I think that's a problem for working class voters too. I think working class voters at this point are not convinced broadly that the public sphere can do anything for them, which is a bigger problem even than the sort of suburban personal freedom.
Although how much of that is because they think that it wouldn't if it were implemented, and how much of it is just because they think that it wouldn't be implemented? Like I know like a common critique, like people thinking about like why Labour lost the last general election in the UK as badly as it did. And it seems like a lot of their policy proposals were individually popular, but I think maybe some voters hear what sounds like this long, elaborate Christmas wish list of like wonderful reforms that could happen, and they just don't take it seriously. They don't think any of that stuff's going to happen.
But don't you think
that's real?
I think that's because they can tell that it's a setup for the state to do things for them, but a state that isn't theirs. So it's not when they actually control. So, for instance, the problem for Labour was that they had, the majority had voted for Brexit. Labour Party was against Brexit. So for all of the stuff that they said, we're doing this for you, they knew that when they had actually articulated a will and acted on it, Labour Party wasn't ready to listen to them. And I think it's a similar problem in the US, which is you might have a state that says it's going to do things for you, but it's not yours because the party isn't yours. And people want these to be, I think people can tell when they're in control and when they're not. I think that it's the kind of problem for the Democratic Party is it's ready to do things for workers, but on terms defined by the Democratic Party. So the order of priorities, the urgency of the needs, the people actually making the decisions are not going to be things determined directly by working class voters, because it's not a working class party, So I think that Matt's right about that, and actually hadn't thought about it until Matt said it. But there's since the Clinton years, there's been something, and even a bit earlier, it's been something very weird about the Democratic Party, which is that it has been the agent both that claims to be the party of competency and competent administration, and the party explaining to everybody the limits on what the state can do. And this kind of is that it's incompetent, and especially incompetent in precisely the spheres when people might want the most intervention, mass provision of universalistic entitlements and welfare services, but super competent when it comes to, coming up with the most targeted possible sort of, urban renewal scheme or managing the Fed or whatever. So I hadn't thought about it until Matt had put it quite that way, but and I think that it just communicates to everyone who's really in control.
Yeah, and this question of who's in control is good, and this is kind of what I'd like to get back to in the last few minutes, because something that we talked about earlier, but I'd like to kind of, put a bow on, maybe go through one last time a little more slowly, is this idea, something you talk about a lot, Alex, this small r Republican notion of freedom, which is related to that kind of positive freedom that Rob was talking about earlier, which is the idea that freedom should be understood not just in that sort of like narrow libertarian way of freedom from coercion, and not even just in terms of your right to do certain things, but in terms of this kind of conception that's bound up in civic participation, where the analogy is with these ancient republics, Greece and Rome, which is why the pro-slavery version of it says in ways that we talked about earlier that, well, look, you wouldn't have had everybody in Athens wouldn't have had time to do all that direct democracy stuff if they hadn't had a slave class. You need some people to be unfree so others are truly free, and the in the anti-slavery version, in the later labor Republican version, says no. Some people have, habits of domination, that they're not going to be able to relate to others as equals. You need everybody to be free in order to truly have this, so they can relate to each other as political equals, and they can be and they can. Maybe we can reduce working hours so everybody has time to to fully participate. And I think that like maybe the sort of more optimistic way to look at your insight from earlier, and maybe Matt, you can get on this at the end, is that okay? So even when people have that sort of resistance to taxation to fund social programs, not just because of the bite, right? Like Alex was saying, but because they think it interferes with their life plans, it interferes with a certain kind of substantive freedom, what they've built up for themselves, which is sort of the modern equivalent, the sort of professional class equivalent of what Abraham Lincoln is talking about as the ideal of freedom is, okay, maybe you have to be a wage laborer for a while, but then you get to be a small farmer, and you're truly free. So I think that actually reflects something that might be optimistic, right? That like there might be something you can take from this that would actually be good for the left, which is to think that, look, ultimately what really moves most people the most is not this sort of legalistic libertarian idea of freedom. Because look, the people that you're talking about, the professional class people who are resistant to taxation, they're not taxationist theft people. That's not their beef with this. Their beef with this is that they think it stops them from being able to pursue the sorts of lives that they built for themselves and they should be able to build for themselves, and that are tied into their status in society. And I think that there might be a way to build on that, not in a way that's marketed towards the professional class, because as Matt has laid out, that's not ever going to be, a reliable base, for this kind of social program, but in a way that's targeted to the working class. Say, hey, look, we want everybody, right, to be able to have some control over their life outcomes, and that's the basis for our politics. So there's a question from a patron, which I'll just quickly paraphrase before I throw this back to Matt, which was roughly about like how a sort of good left-wing way of understanding freedom can be used in future electoral politics. So Matt, maybe you could speak to any element of that, right? Either the sort of nuts and bolts electoral takeaway, or the sort of broader idea that there is something here that, even though it has reactionary versions, does show that the sort of vision of freedom that we'd want is one that, I think people are going to find intuitively appealing.
Yeah, I actually think probably Rob and Alex would have better ideas about how to, sort of at the theoretical level, about how to sort of, build positive freedom into sort of slogans and ideas that people feel speak to them and can use, that they can use. I guess I would say I wanted to sort of respond to this. So what Alex said about, or what we were all talking earlier about, basically about competence and meritocracy, and where that ideology is taking us, and how that relates to this question of freedom. I think, because on one level you are beginning to see at least a kind of academic intellectual revolt against meritocracy. Like you're starting to see a new spate of books, and it hasn't totally sort of trickled down yet, if that's the kind of intellectual theory of diffusion that we're using here. But I mean, it started at Yale, and we'll see if it gets to Syracuse soon. I don't know, but there are awful lot of Ivy League professors talking about how meritocracy is a disease, which everyone can point out the irony of that. But I do wonder what to make of that, and where that will go, and if not to sort of go against all the writing that I've been doing for years about pessimism about the professional class as a vehicle, but I do wonder if there is an ideological opening to sort of go after, not just to go after the sort of minimum of sort of fiscal redistributive point, but to go after the ideological fortress of personal responsibility. Because I actually think if you put it on paper, I don't think meritocracy is very popular as an idea. I think it's popular when it's intuited and when it's kind of talked around. I don't think it's popular when it's actually explicated, when it's actually like laid out, because it's so profoundly inegalitarian, and it's so remorselessly, in effect, kind of cruel and undemocratic. I'm higher than you because I'm better than you. It's far more savage than than even a kind of even in some ways a sort of Gilded Age capitalism, where it might be because you had a lucky you had an uncle or a father-in-law that gave you a leg up, or maybe you just worked harder. That meritocracy is almost deeper than that, because it's about the sort of some sort of essence, some kind of quiddity within you that has given you the good things of this world. I do actually, maybe I'm outing myself as another deluded Ivy League professor who's criticizing meritocracy, but I actually do think that there are some ideological legs there to sort of not just critique the word, but to really take a battering ram to that idea, and the extent to which it pervades, and it shows up in all sorts of different ways in the kind of the cult of saying, the cult of believing in science, which is, just absolutely, an outrageous insult to to say that if you don't vote for the party that I like, you don't believe in science. Do we understand how condescending and idiotic that sounds, frankly? Even though, and I'm not denying that there are plenty of people who, we can have disagreements about, I'm not denying COVID or something like the YouTube boxer, but I'm saying, but I do think that putting this kind of cult of meritocracy, expertise, professional know-how, putting that under the microscope and squashing it as best we can in our little mini function as intellectuals, I think that's as important as any of the kind of fiscal or economistic arguments about our policy, because I think that ideological fortress is the one that we need to storm.
This, by the way, I really like that. And this, by the way, Matt, is where we can definitely say that Lincoln was more radical than any of the contemporaries, because meritocracy is linked to a specific conception of equality of opportunity or freedom, which is that everyone should be equally free to compete for scarce positions of power and privilege. And the 20% that happen to win that competition become the meritocracy, and the 80% just get the rest, the shitty fucking whatever's left in the economy. Whereas Lincoln's view was that of equality of opportunity was fundamentally non-competitive. He just said, so long as everyone works hard enough, everyone should be able to attain the same condition of independence. That's the whole point of that famous quote. It
right.
is intragenerational. It's not like your children or your children's children might someday get to go to college. It's that if that prudent penniless beggar works hard enough, they should be able to not have to spend their entire life working for wages. And it's a radically different understanding of what the kinds of opportunities ought to be that are available to people, and a very different understanding, therefore, of freedom. Everybody who works hard enough should be able to attain some position in society that allows them to develop some talents and achieve a position of respect and status, which is the opposite, as Matt said, of the meritocracy.
The right to rise, which is the name of Jeb Bush's super PAC, comes out of Lincoln's phrase, that same Lincoln speech. The right to rise. That's a great point, Alex. It's a universal right, right to rise. It's not a right for the cream to rise and the rest to sink, or the wheat to rise and the chaff to sink. It's a universal right. That's powerful. I've got to run, guys. I've got to do baby stuff. But I really enjoyed chatting with you guys. This has been really stimulating.
Yeah, I'm excited to. I'm happy that you said that. I'm excited that you're doing the 19th century Rick Perlstein thing and doing a book about each decade. That's going to be fun.
Pray for me. I haven't. It's been hard lately, but I got to get back. I'm getting off Twitter, and I'm going to get back into the archives.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Matt.
Bye, guys.
Nice to see you, Matt.